What did you make of these talks today between President Putin and President Xi?
Well, I think it's really a reflection that Russia has nowhere else to go. China is looking for economies on sale, of which Russia is, and trying to expend its strategic, economic, and military prowess by preying on the instability in Moscow as it flails in Ukraine with this stalemate. Its peace plan is dead on arrival. And the good news is that it appears that Xi is thinking twice about arming Russia in this flailing conflict in Ukraine. So what came out of it is a boost for Putin, certainly, but not as strategic as he would like. It's a limited partnership where Russia's giving more than it's getting.
Fascinating. Lots of points to pick up on there. Let me ask you, first of all, about this so-called peace plan which President Xi has put forward, which has already pretty much been rejected out of hand by Ukraine and its allies because it doesn't require the Russians to pull their troops out of Ukraine. What do you make of President Xi's efforts to put this forward as a serious plan, but then to go and meet President Putin?
I don't think it was a serious plan. It was the cost of entry of a discussion with President Putin to make it clear that he was on President Putin's side, that he was not going to side with the Ukrainians. And that opened the door to potential economic deals with Russia that can no longer sell its oil to Europe. It's looking, Russia's on sale right now. And the Chinese are fantastic business negotiators, and they see a good deal when they saw it, and they were willing to throw Ukraine under the bus to get there. And the U.S., the West, and President Zelensky are having nothing of it. But what Xi gets out of this, we'll see, it's not public, but will be some trade deals that are on fire sale.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese leader and the Chinese economy are clearly benefiting from the fact that as they're one of the few countries that are not imposing sanctions on Russia, they're picking up an awful lot of the trade, which has now been blocked with the EU, the UK, the US, and so on.
And that's exactly why President Xi made this trip. The only real influence that Ukraine has on their thinking is whether or not we'll pave the way for them to invade Taiwan. The stalemate in Ukraine has made them think twice about going into Taiwan. They realize that it might not be as simple as they might have thought years ago. China is flexing its muscles. It's an economic powerhouse. It's just negotiated a deal with Iran and Saudi Arabia, something that has evaded the West for decades. It is looking for opportunities to expand its Belt and Road Initiative, which is creating a major challenge to the U.S. President Biden has tried to come back with his Build Back Better plan on a global scale, but it still pales in comparison to the influence and the economic might of China. So this trip today with the last couple of days with President Putin underscores the geopolitical game is changing. Russia is looking for new partners, and China, as an economic giant, is willing to push its weight around to try and make sure that Russia is firmly in its camp, as well as potentially Iran. Saudi Arabia is flirting. I don't think Saudi Arabia will jump to that camp, but it's certainly looking for opportunities, and so it's something to pay close attention to. And the West, the Biden administration in Europe, needs to make sure that we counter China's effort to extend its reach in areas of our influence.
The Americans had been warning that China could be about to provide weapons to President Putin. President Xi has been careful, certainly not to declare that he's prepared to do so. Do you think that is just part of this strategic game which President Xi is playing to try to, because obviously if he started providing weapons, he could then face economic sanctions himself?
I don't think it's a game at all. I think President Xi was seriously consider arming Russian as a way of getting into the Russian markets. This is not a strategic play for Ukraine. It's a strategic play for the markets that Russia offers. And the U.S., I think wisely, has begun to use its intelligence as a warning sign. It made it very clear that Russia was going to invade Ukraine in satellite photos and intelligence intercepts in a really new way of using intelligence and revealing much more than we ever would have in the past. And it put the world on notice, and it's really kept Europe united in sanctioning Russia and making it clear that we know exactly what their intentions are and countering the Russian disinformation. And China needs to understand that the same will happen with them. If they start trying to sell weapons to Russia, they'll be called out. It'll be made public. This game of hide and seek no longer works in the world of global intelligence.
Do you think that part of this alliance that seems to be strengthening between President Xi and President Putin, is that, do you think, reinforced by that AUKUS pact, the pact involving the US, Australia, the UK, which is clearly intended to send signals to China not to invade Taiwan and to stress how seriously the Western allies take that sphere of the world?
I think that's absolutely right. And the U.S. and our allies in the region are trying to send a very strong signal that don't try and pull Ukraine on Taiwan. It's a country that has a strong democratic tradition. The U.S. has a defense alliance with them in terms of the 1979 treaty, where we pledged to defend in a ambiguous fashion, but that we will come to provide Taiwan with sufficient materials to defend itself. And that ambiguity, plus the failures in Ukraine, I think have made the Chinese think twice about whether to take over Taiwan if they did a pivot on Hong Kong. They were supposed to have Hong Kong be democratic for a long time, and that lasted very, very little time. And I think just the good news out of all this is they're thinking twice about taking over Taiwan. The bad news is that they're using their economic might to cement economic relationships with Russia, that when this is over, it's not going to serve the West's interest well, or Russia's interest.
We've also just seen that Russia has warned Britain that it's taking steps towards a nuclear collision, and that Moscow could be forced to react after the British government, announced it was sending shells tipped with depleted uranium to Ukraine. This is a defence minister who said that the Challenger 2 tanks, which Britain has said it will supply to Ukraine, would be armed with the shells which penetrate armour more easily, but have been linked to adverse health effects. This is a story being reported in the Times tonight, saying that the announcement caused outrage in Moscow. Do you think this is a significant move?
I honestly haven't had a chance to look at exactly what those provisions are, but I can assure you that there is no nuclear explosion capabilities involved with those weapons, and Moscow's trying to escalate a situation out of proportion with the reality on the ground. What Moscow is doing is perpetuating a fiction from Nazis in Ukraine to the West and infringing on its sovereignty through the expansions of NATO, which pose absolutely no threat to them. This is a completely unprovoked, unjustified invasion, and they're grasping at straws to justify their ongoing slaughter of innocent civilians and invasion of another UN member state's sovereignty. Until this war ends, the West has to stand firm, call them out when we can, push back on those like China that are trying to come to Russian aid, and end this war in Ukraine and restore sovereignty of Ukraine, full stop.
And just finally, we seem to have kept hearing about the prospect of a renewed major offensive in Ukraine by Russian forces. Clearly, there have been some sporadic bombardments of certain cities and so on. But in terms of the overall shape of the war, the front line does not appear to have moved hugely. There is still this horrendous battle going on around Bakhmut. Do you think that we should still expect to see some further renewed offensive by Russia? Or are we now in a long, prolonged, and a huge cost, a stalemate?
I would say a little bit of both. I think everyone anticipates Russia to launch a major offensive. That's why President Zelensky was asking for sophisticated, massive weapons deliveries early so they could get ready for that. But I also don't think it will work from Russia's standpoint. And the more they attack, the more you're going to have a war of attrition with huge casualties on both sides. This is now an indicted war criminal who belongs in The Hague, not in Moscow as head of the government. And the sooner that the Russian people decide that he no longer represents them, the better.